good evening. I'm here at a very difficult time. I realize this. Friday, 6:30. As long as he doesn't get upset. It's Friday, 6:30. Time for cocktails and some blues. Not to be lectured, but here I am. And I'm going to try to make it as exciting as the subject deserves. I'm here to talk about sketching protests and demonstrations. Can we have a show of hands? Who's been to political protests lately? Yes. There was one today. I heard there were two, actually. Yes. We live in a very active time, as you know. Anybody has sketched protests or demonstrations? Fantastic. Would really like to see your work and follow you. This is a subject that I really love, and I love to see what other people are doing in this area. So I'm not here to lecture. I want to share the work I've been doing this last 6 months covering this subject. I want to highlight the work of some other urban sketchers who inspire me. I want to discuss some of my techniques that I discovered and that continue to evolve. And finally, think a little bit about the role of urban sketcher as a historic witness and sort of not just a passive reflector of what's happening. So first I wanted to show you a little snippet of some of the work that I do. This particular one I sketched at a rally in support of the Native Americans. It was happening in Portland, Oregon on March 10th. And basically, the Native Americans have been struggling with the pipeline project that goes through their sacred lands. And this rally was organized sort of in solidarity with that cause. You see a lot of veterans, you see Native Americans in their native costumes. It wasn't a march or a demonstration, so I had a chance to do a lot of detail of costumes as it was a more static event. So let's talk about some reasons. Why am I, first of all, so obsessed with protests and demonstrations? And why do I think this is such a fascinating subject for others also to take on? A little bit of personal history. I grew up in St. Petersburg, Russia, which during the Soviet times at least was branded as a cradle of 3 revolutions. So demonstrations are in my blood. I think. This was exactly 100 years ago. They're celebrating this year the 100th anniversary of the last revolution that happened in the city where I grew up. And when I was little, it wasn't in the 60s, but this was actually a photo I found last week when I was visiting my aunt in Estonia, and my aunt is there, a little girl in the middle. And this is a typical May Day demonstration in Russia. So we had 2 demonstrations that were organized by the government that were completely staged, and people were required to participate if they were employed at certain places. So my dad was required to participate. He would take me twice a year. I thought it was exciting. I would get to sit on his shoulders and watch. And now as I sketch protests, I only wish I had my dad to sit on because it provides a great vantage point. Wonderful for sketching. So I found a sketch. I couldn't find the author. It was in a Russian language textbook that my husband has. And it's kind of a typical May Day. The flyer above says, "Glory to the Soviet people." So as I said, there were 2. One was for the May Day, and incidentally, does anybody know where May Day, the International Workers' Day, originated? That's right. It originated here in Chicago in 1880s in demand for an 8-hour workday. At the time, people were working 16-hour days, and it sort of provoked this big global movement, and it's still celebrated a lot of places in the world, but not in the United States, ironically. The 16-hour workday is still a thing. As I talked to some very hardworking Chicagoans here, I realized that a lot of them are working 2 or 3 jobs, so they just have to now commute between their jobs and still maintain that schedule. So this is a May Day recently in Portland, the sketch that I did. May Day sort of evolved into this, in the United States at least, into this general anti-capitalist, slightly anarchist movement. So still speaking of the reasons for why drawing protests, depending on how you feel on economic and political situation in your country, going to protest could be almost therapeutic. A lot of friends that I have, I know, lost a little bit of faith in humanity after this last November. So going to protests, seeing people who care, who want to bring about change, is a great sort of psychological health device for us. You see people who volunteer to bring tea, soup to the protesters, so that's always very moving for me. There's this idea that you hear a lot, people do not trust the traditional news media sources. So perhaps reporting on events through sketching could be an interesting alternative. It is a lot more personal and subjective than traditional reporting methods with a camera and video camera. And for that reason, it could be intuitively more trustworthy. People tend to trust things that take a lot of time and effort and skill to produce, like a sketch. Sketching requires being very attentive to your subject with all of your senses. So the result is oftentimes more authentic. As a sketching reporter, at protests, you're very vulnerable. As I stand there with my watercolor palette, faced with police and anti-riot gear, Antifa protesters chanting, I am almost invisible. As soon as you put a camera in front of you and the subject, people's attitudes, behaviors change. So why would reporting on politics or world events could be more effective through drawing? I think in the world where we feel nothing is real, quiet reporting that's done through drawing could take on a new importance. There's a great reportage done by sketchers from Hong Kong on Umbrella Movement from 2014. This is an example by Rob Sketcherman, who's here at the conference. I still haven't met him, but I really hope I will. Still talking about reasons for sketching, protests generate an amazing amount of energy. I feel sort of palpable excitement whenever I'm about to go and sketch a protest. It's a mixture of a little bit of personal risk, the creativity that you usually see at protests, and solidarity with the people who are coming together to march or protest for a cause. In Portland, we even have a dedicated brass band for protests. They're called Unprecedented Brass Band. So you hear, I sketched them. They really liked it. People putting so much creative energy into their signs, their props, they're coming to express their position is just a really moving experience for me. You also feel like you're taking part in something important, something that's bigger than yourself, something that is very transient, it will disappear very quickly, and something historic. This is a sketch from, part of it from the Inauguration Day protest, and part of it is from the Women's March. And the Women's March was estimated to be the biggest protest in human history. So speaking about other sketchers and how their work inspires me every day, I wanted to start by talking about Victoria Lamasco. I discovered her work only about 2 months ago, and she is not formally an urban sketcher, but what she does is pretty much in line with our manifesto. And she had a huge influence on me because she covers resistance movement in Russia, which we never hear anything about in the United States. And she has a book that I highly recommend called Other Russias. It's a book of graphic reportage on groups that are very silent and marginalized in current Russian society, like kids in juvenile prisons and modern-day slaves, sex workers, and of course protesters that are also partially criminalized in Russia. So this is once again the side of Russian society that you never hear being discussed in Russian media. You also don't hear it being discussed in American media. American media tends to conflate Russian people with the Russian government and making it seem like the Russians are all walking in lockstep with Putin. Another sketcher that has a huge influence on me is Inma Serrano. She works in Spain. She has done a lot of protests locally in her country. This one is in Madrid. Suhita, who's here, has sketched the women's protest and actually turned it into a very creative act of fundraising for ACLU. So I think they raised close to $2,300 for American Civil Liberties Union, sorry. Finally, I want to mention the great giants of sketching reportage about resistance movement, Veronica Lauer and Melanie Rhyme. They really should be here in my place talking about their work. Please check it out. It's phenomenal. So speaking more directly about my work, in the last 7 months, I sketched and attended 10 protests, all in the city where I live, Portland, Oregon. And some of them were marches, some of them were rallies. Each one had a very distinct look, message, color, and energy. I like to use this homemade accordion books for covering protests. They're not very easy to manipulate, but I really love the feel of kind of a continuous narrative, unfolding story, the impression that they create. So one protest kind of seamlessly blends into the next. And this presentation kind of goes with this message that, unfortunately, the way we receive news nowadays is so disjointed. We never feel any kind of historic parallel context for the information that we receive. So I think we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes without having context to what's happening. The tools have to be pretty minimal, as a lot of times I'm walking, oops, this is gonna play. A lot of times I'm walking or even running, so I just have my basic pen. I have a little watercolor wristwatch that I made. I try to just grab the main color from each protest. Like in this case of the Raging Grannies, they were standing for a while, so I was able to get more detail in. But it's happening pretty fast, so you have to be very minimal with your tools and use the time-tested tools. So I think there are at least 3 or 4 events just in this clip. You see how they're one grows into the other. Oh, somebody's profile. So I try to pick at least one or two colors that are very characteristic and characterizes the mood of the protests. You know, some of them are angry, some of them are more jubilant, some of them are celebratory. The Women's March was easy because of the famous pink hats. This is a pride parade that was very colorful, so there's an absolute fruit salad of color in this particular one. So this was a float with stationary bikes, and I was fascinated with it so much I ended up kind of running behind it for a while. Others, I'm standing on the sidelines and sketching what's happening. My approach has sort of evolved gradually. I used to stand in the shadows and sort of secretly sketch and eavesdrop on people's conversations. I think Victoria Lamasco's work has really changed that. She tends to interact with her subjects directly in a more journalistic way. So I started to push myself out of my introverted shell and start to talk to people and ask them questions, as was the case with this cop who was holding a lot of gear on him. He said he carries about 50 pounds of gear, including flash grenade launcher and a non-lethal semi-automatic rifle, sticks, various handcuffs. And as it is Portland, he's a anti-riot cop on a bike, which we do have. Some challenges that wanted to mention in this particular subject is trying to focus your attention when so much is happening at the same time. There are people marching, chanting. There are really interesting signs that you try to record. Sometimes they do start throwing tear gas, so people start running, and trying to capture that and still staying semi-safe. So one mistake I was doing initially is trying to march, trying to participate in the demonstration and sketch at the same time. It was a bad idea. Mostly because you get stuck behind the same people and you don't get a good perspective of things that are going on. And sometimes if it's a very crowded event, you can't get out of it very easily. So I started checking out the routes. If it's a march, I check out the map where it's going to take place, so I know what would be a good vantage point to sketch from. These are some of the sort of in-process sketches of events that are happening. Weather is another big obstacle. We had a very, very cold and long and very wet winter in Portland, so parking garages became my friends. I started looking for cover and sketching from a parking garage, which is still open enough to be able to see out. This is the in-process of the gay parade that I sketched. Personal safety is something that I get asked about a lot, whether I feel it is safe to sketch protests, and generally it is. They're very much family-oriented events. There was one exception. I don't know if you heard, we had a pretty horrific thing happen in Portland with kind of this deranged white supremacist guy attacking two girls on a train. And three men interfered, trying to shield them. And he unfortunately stabbed all three of them and killed two, and one was wounded. And timing was unfortunate, but there was a free speech rally that was happening. There's a group that kind of moves to very left-leaning cities in the United States and agitates people. We have a very active Antifa, anti-fascist movement in Portland. So They scheduled a rally which provoked 3 counter-protests that were taking place at the same time. There were hundreds of police, thousands of protesters, and sort of the whole confusion with so many different factions coming and creating almost a military situation in the city is that you don't know what side is what and who's with who. So this guy who just kind of happened to be there, he, for me, represented some of the absurdities that sometimes you see. He just kind of aimlessly walked there, and he's looking around confused and asking to no one in particular, so which ones here are the Nazis? So that protest did end up in tear gas grenades and arrests. It was a little tense. This is more of the sketches of the same event. So when the program for the symposium went online, I received an email from a person who thought that my talk was very political and did not fit the symposium's mantra of being an apolitical organization. And I completely understand that sketching for me is also a refuge. And it's nice to have certain things that are free of politics and emotions that surround it. Then later that, right before the event, I got a phone call from Alex, and she was, at that point for sure, I thought, okay, they're going to cancel my talk. It's too out there. Unfortunately, she was calling to tell me that one of our presenters who was supposed to be here, Majid Madir, was denied an entry visa and could not be here. And they were fearing that there would perhaps be others who could not be present. Majid's postcard should be in your bag of goodies, so check out his work. I think it's very unfortunate that he's not here with us at the symposium. But this story sort of reaffirmed for me that, yes, it was important to draw the subject and to talk about it here. I want to finish with a beautiful quote that somebody actually posted under one of my protest sketches. And it's by Paul Klee, which is, I think, a German artist. And he says, "Art does not reproduce what we see, rather it makes us see." I think as urban sketchers, we walk the line of reflecting what we see unfiltered, if such thing even exists, and making others see what's important for us. Urban sketchers are witnesses, and we turn our gaze to things that move us, that are important for us. So every time we pick up our pen, we maybe should ask ourselves, what are we advocating for? Be it a beautiful park or a historic building, a luscious tree, or an amazing neighborhood. We don't just merely reflect what we see, but we become advocates for those things. And in that sense, urban sketching is political. And an urban sketcher is in a perfect position to blend art and journalism and activism. And hopefully I inspired you today to ask yourself a question: what or who am I advocating for? I think I have some time for questions. I have my cards if you want to follow my work, and I also have my sketches with me, some of them, if you want to look at them in person. Yes. The question was, in the accordion books, what kind of paper are you using? And that's the question that I always never have the answer for, because it's a printer's stock that sort of changes. I work in graphic design, so I get a lot of oversupply paper from the printers I work with. And it's just a thick brochure, uncoated stock. The question is, does it come in long length? The answer is they cut it to about, I think, 30 inches, but then I glue it together, and you can make it as long as you want. Yes. The question is, have you considered publishing this as a children's book, as it has a lot of potential? I'm sorry, I'm repeating the questions. I've been told to do that. Yes, I am looking to publish this as the volume sort of gets thicker. I think I'll have still a lot of material, I have a feeling. I haven't thought exactly for children. I try to only think in adult terms, but I think it's a great idea. Lapin. The question is there an association that wants to use this drawings for their purposes? And I am looking, I've offered some of the organizations, but I just didn't have the right contacts because I did want to make it sort of a gift donation to whoever wanted to use it for their cause. Yes? Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't hear you at all. Do you mind coming up closer? Or maybe just come up here and ask into the microphone. Thank you.
The question was obviously you're combining urban sketching with journalism, and being from Russia, I attended a talk by Anna Politkovskaya years ago, and we asked her about how she felt about her personal safety and if she'd ever felt under threat and how she balanced the need to get the reportage out there with the need to feel safe. And I just wondered, as urban sketching moves more towards journalism, do you have any concerns in that area? How do you feel about reporting in Russia, given the situation there?
One of the reasons, I hope you all heard the question. No? She was asking about, there's a famous Russian journalist, Anna Politkovskaya, and Russian journalists, as you know, are in a lot more dangerous position that we are at this moment in the United States, at least. And she was asking about the personal safety and how would I feel about as Urban Sketchers moves more toward journalism, or I personally do more of this work, say in a place like Russia, how would I feel about personal safety? And of course, I would have to reassess it there. I think we're still lucky to live in a society where political dissent is not criminalized, at least compared to some other places where protesting could be punishable by prison sentences and sometimes even death. I just read in the news today that in Venezuela, all sorts of protests is now criminal, at least for 5 days, as they're moving into a referendum. So it's good to keep in mind that we're, at least in this country, still can openly protest, and we can report from these events without feeling threatened personally. And the reason I really respect what Victoria Lamasco is doing is because she is just badass doing it in Russia. Oh, that's a great question. What news media, what information do you get to know when something is happening? We have a local newspaper that publishes something that they call the resistance calendar. So that's something that I usually check as going to protests sort of became almost like a second job for me. So I check their calendar. And when you start going to these events and you make contacts, you also learn. I met this great man who's representing the homeless in Portland, and he asked me to join an event that they were doing. So you start to network, and you sort of know what is happening and when. I think that's all the time we have. So thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate you being here on Friday night.